Okay, so we're looking at time series now. So time series is when we have bivariate data. And time is one of our variables, and time is always the explanatory variable. So we're always going to see like some type of time in terms of, it could be months, it could be days, it could be years. So just be careful. It doesn't have to be just years. And it could be time as well, like, maybe 6 hourly as well. So, anyway, along there is going to be a numerical time number, and then you'll have your response at, and whatever you're looking at. And this will also be a numerical. So we get this scatter plot sort of thing happening. But the thing with the time series is we actually join the dots. So they're just simply joining the dots that we've created with our scatter plot. So in an exam, you don't really draw up a lot of scatter plots, graphs. So, and if you have to do one in a SAC and that, it's not, like, you can do it on your calculator, but it doesn't really matter. If you physically just got to join the dots, so that's easy. All right, so we're going to look at the time series, and obviously what we do is we have to say, what does this data show us, or the trend. So the first thing we might look at is what we say is the trend. Okay, so even though so we've got this time, and can you see that even though it is fluctuating, so sometimes it goes up and down, we're seeing that overall, over the many years, we're seeing it going up. So we call that an upward trend. Okay, and then if you look here, the same thing is happening with this one. Like, there is some up and downs, but overall, if you go over the time they're doing, we saw a downward trend. Okay, so in this time series down below, sometimes we might see a couple. So you might say, all right, we had an upward trend up to 1960, then we had a downward trend, and then it was still going downwards, but it was a lot slower rate and things like that. So that's what we'll look at. So if you look at this, now remember, they always use real data. So this data they collect from something. So this one was actually the birth rate. So once we say, oh, look, there was a peak in births until 1960, and then something happened here and it went down. And I can tell you, probably in the history, that was, I think, the Great Depression after the Second World War, and birth rates went down, okay? And things like that. All right, and then they might have started peaking up again in the 80s, the baby boomers, I think they were called, and stuff like that. All right, so that's why you can think logically sometimes, and that can help you. All right, the second thing we could look at in a time series, now this just means we might see it, but there may be this or there may not be, so you need to be able to look for it, and it's called seasonal variation. And what that means is, it says here x-axis, you must be divided into at least 4 sections over 2 or more time periods. So you need to see it. You need to be able to see it fairly regularly to say that it is seasonal. So for example, if you have a look here, this was, they were talking about in a hotel, the percentage of rooms that were hired out, I don't know what you say, rented out, okay, in the hotel. Can you see in June, it dropped there, and then June it's a bit lower, and then it's gone along, and in June it dipped again. So see how it's dipping all the time in June? That would mean we're going to say there's a seasonal aspect to that, because something's happening at the same time within the period. So here they're talking about, I think they're doing quarterly years. We're seeing a drop at the same quarter of each year. So, and that would make sense. So June, say this was an Australian thing, so say it was in Queensland, like they don't get as many people in the winter as they do in the summer. So that's the dropping, and that would make sense, wouldn't it? But this is still a business, and it's still hotel business. So we can see, though, the overall trend is going up. So this graph, if you were describing this, you would still say it had an upward trend, and I'm going to say with seasonality, yeah? Because it's also the seasonality, because we're seeing a little drop in the June every month. Okay, so this is when seasonality is when it's happening within a small, like a time period. So if you see what I mean, it's happening between a time period. So can you see, like, because it was every June of those quarters, that was seasonality. Because the other thing we can have is what we call cycles. And cycles is when there's like huge amounts of years in between, like a huge amount of time periods, but you are seeing it. So can you see, like here, it's like peaking every, it peaks every 10 years. So that's a fair chunk. You know, it's not happening within the year, it's happening every 10 years. So if we see over a 2 to 5 year period, we like to call it, now it says cycles, you just might write here that it's cyclic. They use that word, cyclic. Okay, so yeah, so that's happening. So what was this? Sunspots on the, I think it was on the sun, I don't know. Apparently they must come up every 10 years. I don't know about that stuff. All right, so it could be that. So this one though, if you have a look, we would say this one, really, if you look at every 10 year though, see how it's not really going up. So there's no up or downward trend in that one. There's just cyclic, okay? So then, now nearly every, you can have random variation, and nearly every time series would have this, because life does not produce, perfect patterns, very rarely. So nearly most of all time series plots will show random variation. So you can always be safe saying it's got random variation, yeah? So this one here, this one really showing no upward or downward trend, like overall. So this one, you just say random. You may say it had a dip in that, but in whatever, year 12 or whatever, but you don't really get stuff like that. All right, so if we go, let's go. Here's an exam question. So consider the time series below. The pattern in the time series plot shown above is best described as having. So I just want to bring your attention. So these are talking about months. So if you look here, you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So it dropped at 6. And then it looks like, say that's 1 year, but can you see it dropped again here after 6 months when you went into the new year, and then it dropped again. So here we're going to say it has seasonality. If you look though at those drops every 6 months, can you see it's sort of remaining the same? So no upward or downward trend there, yeah? So we would just say definitely has random variation, or irregular fluctuations they're calling it, but it does have seasonality. So which answer would we go? C. Yep, we're going to go C. It has irregular fluctuations, so that's another way of saying random variation. Same thing. So we've got that one. All right, now let's look at this one. So just be careful. I've popped this in your notes. So when we talk about the upward and downward trends, the trend for values in a time series is generally an increase or a decrease over a significant period of time. So that means we need to see over a thing. So up here, they want us to describe this time series. Now we have to be careful. If you mark these days out, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then you'd have the next week, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then there would be 7 and 1, 2, 3. So here you can see we had a drop on day 2 and 3. But in the next week, it didn't really, it sort of has done a different sort of thing. And then here, 2 and 3, it's actually peaked up. So there's no seasonality there. Yeah, this one has there's no seasonality. Now, so we definitely won't look for that because they're dropping at different times. Now you've got to look at the overall trend, and what you can see, you've got to say, right, we started on, say, even if we just look at day 7, because we can see that. So we got 7, and then we've got 14's here, and then 21's about there. So really, we're not really plateauing. We're not going up and down either. So I would say that this, all it has is that randomness. So which answer are we going to go with? B, yeah. Just got irregular fluctuation. Be really careful because it can look like it has seasonality. So just check that it's doing it on the same days.